John Christie stands as one of the most disturbing figures in British criminal history, a man whose crimes shocked the post-war nation and exposed serious failures within the criminal justice system. Over a 10-year period, Christie murdered at least 8 people, committing acts of such brutality that they became the subject of intense public scrutiny and official inquiries. What makes Christie's case particularly troubling is not only the nature of his crimes, but the fact that an innocent man was executed for murders Christie himself had committed. The case of Timothy Evans, who went to the gallows in 1950 for crimes he did not commit, remains one of the most controversial miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Christie's story is one of a deeply disturbed man whose early life was marked by trauma and rejection, whose psychological problems festered unchecked, and whose manipulation of the authorities allowed him to evade suspicion for years while continuing to prey on vulnerable women. It is also the story of a police investigation riddled with incompetence, of evidence overlooked, and of a killer whose word was trusted over that of a desperate man trying to save his own life. The eventual exposure of Christie and the exoneration of Evans came too late for the man who had already paid the ultimate price, but it did lead to fundamental changes in British law and contributed to the eventual abolition of capital punishment. In the year 1899, on a quiet April morning in the industrial town of Halifax, a child was born who would one day become one of Britain's most infamous killers. John Christie entered the world on April 8th in Boothtown, a neighborhood near Halifax in Yorkshire, arriving as the 6th of 7 children into a household already strained by poverty and emotional coldness. His father, Ernest John Christie, worked as a carpet designer, a man whose professional eye for detail stood in sharp contrast to his complete inability to show warmth or affection to his own children. Ernest was austere and emotionally distant, a figure who seemed to occupy the same house as his family rather than truly live among them. He dispensed punishment for even the smallest infractions with mechanical precision, creating an atmosphere of fear and tension that permeated every room. The children learned to move quietly through their home, to make themselves small, to avoid drawing attention that might result in harsh words or harder blows. John's mother and older sisters offered no consistent refuge from this coldness and fear. Instead, they were as unpredictable as the English weather itself, sometimes lavishing attention and affection on young John, other times joining in the mockery and bullying that made his early years so bewildering. He never quite knew which version of his family he would encounter each day, and this uncertainty left deep marks on his developing mind. When Christie was 11 years old, death came to the family home in the form of his grandfather, David Halliday, who had been slowly fading away from a long illness. The old man's body was laid out on a trestle table in the family home, a common practice of the era for neighbors and relatives to pay their respects. Most children might have felt sadness at such a sight, or perhaps fear and confusion about death's finality. But Christie's response was different, troublingly different, and it offered a glimpse into something broken within him. He later described experiencing a strange sensation of power and well-being as he looked upon his grandfather's corpse, a man he had once feared, now rendered completely powerless. This moment, this dark pleasure in death and domination, would echo through the rest of his life. Despite the turbulent nature of his home, Christie proved himself to be an able and intelligent student. At age 11, he won a competitive scholarship to Halifax Secondary School, a considerable achievement that spoke to his intellectual capabilities. Mathematics captivated him, particularly the abstract elegance of algebra, and he showed equal talent in history and woodwork, subjects that required both careful thought and practical skill. Intelligence tests conducted later in his life would reveal an IQ of 128, well above average, marking him as a bright boy with considerable potential. Yet all his academic abilities could not help him navigate the social world of school. His peers remembered him as odd and withdrawn, a boy who kept very much to himself and struggled to fit in with the rough-and-tumble culture of schoolyard life. They saw him as unpopular, different, someone who did not quite belong to their world. When he left school on April 22, 1913, at the age of 14, Christie took work as an assistant projectionist at a cinema, beginning his transition from childhood to the adult world. It was modest work, operating the projection equipment in the darkened booth above the cinema floor, but it gave him employment and a small wage. As Christie moved through adolescence and into early manhood, he faced a challenge that would torment him for the rest of his life. His early attempts at sexual intimacy ended in failure and humiliation. The other young men, cruel as they often are, seized upon his difficulties and branded him with nicknames that bit deep and lingered. They called him Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie, nicknames that spread through his social circles like a stain that would not wash out. This sexual dysfunction would remain with him throughout his entire life, a persistent problem that meant he could rarely perform with anyone other than prostitutes, women who had no choice but to tolerate his inadequacy. Yet when a post-mortem examination was conducted after his death, pathologists found that his genitals were entirely normal, suggesting that his difficulties stemmed entirely from his mind rather than from his body. The problem was psychological, rooted in the trauma and rejection of his early years, but that knowledge would come far too late to change anything. In September 1916, as the First World War raged across Europe and the trenches demanded more and more men, Christie made the decision to enlist in the British Army. Perhaps he hoped that military service would make him a man, would give him purpose and belonging, or perhaps he simply had nowhere else to go. In April 1917, he was formally called up and assigned to serve as an infantryman with the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment. When his regiment was dispatched to France in April 1918, as the war entered its final bloody phase, Christie was reassigned to the Duke of Wellington's regiment as a signalman, a role that placed him closer to the front lines and greater danger. In June 1918, Christie experienced something that would profoundly affect him and become central to his personal mythology for the rest of his life. A mustard gas attack struck his unit, a weapon of terrible indiscriminate cruelty that burned the lungs and blinded the eyes of those exposed to it. Christie was injured in the attack and spent a month recovering in a military hospital in Calais, treating wounds and breathing difficulties that the gas had inflicted upon him. Upon his release from the hospital, Christie began to construct an elaborate narrative about his experience. He claimed that the chemical weapon had blinded him completely and rendered him mute for 3.5 years, and that it had permanently damaged his ability to speak at normal volume, leaving his voice thin and difficult to hear. This dramatic story became part of his identity, something he could reference to explain his difficulties and to elicit sympathy from others. Yet the truth, as it so often is, appears more complicated and considerably less sympathetic. Historian Ludovic Kennedy, investigating Christie's background decades later, found no medical records to support the claim of blindness. Kennedy noted that a man who had remained mute would never have been discharged from the hospital as fit for active duty. If Christie could not speak at all, he would have remained hospitalized and marked as permanently unfit for service. Kennedy concluded instead that Christie's inability to speak loudly was a psychological response to his trauma, not a lasting physical consequence of the gas exposure. Kennedy attributed this pattern of exaggeration and fabrication to a histrionic personality disorder, a psychological condition that drove Christie to magnify or invent illnesses and disabilities in order to gain the attention and sympathy that he so desperately craved. It was a useful framework for understanding how Christie used his perceived victimhood as a tool, a way to make others pay attention to him, to make them feel sorry for him. Christie was demobilized from the army on October 22, 1919, returning to civilian life with his war wounds, real or imagined. Several years later, on December 13, 1923, he joined the Royal Air Force, seeking perhaps another institution that might give his life structure and meaning. But his time in the RAF proved short-lived and disappointing. He was discharged on August 15, 1924, after just 8 months of service, and he returned once again to the uncertain world of civilian employment. In the spring of 1920, Christie met a woman named Ethel Simpson, who had come to Halifax from the nearby town of Bradford. Ethel was a working-class woman with modest expectations, and perhaps she saw something in Christie that suggested he might be salvageable, that his difficulties could be overcome with patience and love. The two were married on May 10, 1920, at Halifax Register Office, a simple ceremony that marked what Ethel surely hoped would be the beginning of a better life. Yet the marriage began under difficult and deeply troubling circumstances. Christie's sexual problems, which had plagued him throughout adolescence and early manhood, did not miraculously disappear upon marriage. He continued to visit prostitutes throughout the early years of their marriage, unable or unwilling to attempt sexual relations with his wife in any meaningful way. This must have been a source of profound humiliation and hurt for Ethel, a woman who had married expecting to build a normal life with children and companionship. Early in the marriage, Ethel became pregnant, and for a brief time there was hope that they might have a child together. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, a devastating loss that added another layer of disappointment and pain to their already strained relationship. The couple continued to try to make their marriage work despite these fundamental problems, but after 4 years together, the weight of accumulated disappointment and incompatibility became too much to bear. They separated, and Ethel returned to working-class employment to support herself. She found work at the Garside Engineering Company in Bradford, where she labored in what was undoubtedly demanding and unglamorous work. Later, she moved to the English Electrical Company, also in Bradford, where she remained employed until 1928. That year, Ethel and her siblings made the decision to leave Yorkshire behind and move to Sheffield, seeking perhaps better opportunities or simply a fresh start in a new town. Meanwhile, Christie had embarked upon his own journey in a different direction. In 1923, he left Yorkshire and moved to London, the great capital city that draws so many seeking to remake themselves and escape their pasts. London in the 1920s was a sprawling metropolis of opportunity and danger, a place where a man could disappear into the crowds or reinvent himself entirely. For the next decade, Christie spent much of his time in and out of prison, cycling through periods of employment and crime with depressing regularity. During these long years of separation, Ethel remained in Yorkshire with her relatives, quietly building a life without him, perhaps hoping that he might eventually disappear from her life entirely. She could not have known that he would reappear or what he had done during those years apart. It was not until January 1934, after Christie had spent more time than not behind bars, that he was released from prison once again. This time, something appeared to change within him, or at least in his circumstances. Christie and Ethel reconciled, a surprising decision given all that had passed between them. Perhaps Ethel was lonely, or perhaps Christie made promises of reform and a better life. Whatever the reasons, the couple decided to give their marriage another chance. They moved together into 10 Rillington Place, a modest terraced house located in the Notting Hill area of London, a neighborhood that would become permanently associated with Christie's crimes. It was in this house, in this building that would later become infamous, that they would spend the remainder of their lives together. The first decade of Christie's marriage to Ethel was marked by a troubling and repetitive pattern of petty crimes and acts of violence that seemed to define much of his existence before the Second World War began. On January 10, 1921, Christie secured employment as a postman in Halifax, a position that gave him access to valuable items that passed through the postal system. Postal orders, essentially early forms of secure payment, represented cash that could be intercepted and stolen, and the temptation proved too much for Christie to resist. Just over a month into his employment, on February 20th and then again on March 26, 1921, he was caught stealing postal orders. The consequences came swiftly and without mercy. On April 12, 1921, he was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment and was sent to serve his time at HM Prison, Manchester. He remained there in confinement until his release on June 27, returning to a life that continued much as before. His time inside the prison walls, surrounded by other criminals and subject to the harsh discipline of the institution, appeared to do little to reform him or change his trajectory. Just over a year after his release, on January 15, 1923, Christie faced the courts again, this time charged with obtaining money on false pretenses and with violent conduct. The magistrate, perhaps hoping that leniency might succeed where harshness had failed, bound him over and placed him on probation for 12 months rather than sentencing him to imprisonment. But the warning proved ineffective. a gentle gesture that Christie either did not understand or chose to ignore. During 1924, he committed two further offenses involving larceny, stealing from others with apparent indifference to the consequences. By September 22nd of that year, he was back before the courts and back in prison, this time at HM Prison Wandsworth, where he served consecutive sentences of 3 months and then 6 months. The years passed in a pattern that must have seemed inevitable to anyone observing Christie's life. After his release from Wandsworth, Christie managed to secure more stable employment as a lorry driver, a job that required him to transport goods across London and the surrounding areas. For over 2 years he held this position, and for a brief time it appeared that he might have found some sort of equilibrium, some way to function within society without constantly breaking its laws. But stability was not something Christie was capable of maintaining for long. This period of relative calm and lawful behavior was shattered on May 13, 1929, when his volatile and aggressive nature erupted into violence. Christie assaulted a woman named Maud Cole, a woman with whom he was living at 6 Almeric Road in Battersea, a residential area of South London. The assault was brutal and severe. Christie struck Cole over the head with a cricket bat, a weapon he wielded with apparent fury. The magistrate who heard the case was appalled by the severity of the attack and the violence it represented. He described it in his judgment as a murderous attack, language that suggested the magistrate believed Christie capable of much worse. For this serious violence, Christie was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor and returned to HM Prison Wandsworth, where he had been imprisoned before. Yet even this serious conviction and time in prison did not curb Christie's criminal behavior. In November of 1933, on November 1st specifically, he was convicted of car theft and imprisoned at Wandsworth for a further 3 months. By this point in his life, Christie's pattern of small-time offenses had become almost cyclical, a predictable rhythm of crime and punishment that seemed to define his entire existence. His prospects for the future appeared remarkably bleak, and it seemed that he would spend the remainder of his life cycling in and out of prisons, committing petty crimes and serving short sentences. Yet when Christie was finally released from prison in January 1934, something shifted in his circumstances and possibly in his thinking. He and Ethel reconciled after their years apart, a surprising development that suggested that perhaps both of them had reached some sort of acceptance or understanding. Remarkably, Christie abandoned his recourse to petty crime following his release and his reconciliation with Ethel. Though he continued to visit prostitutes to satisfy his sexual needs, a habit that seems to have been irresistible to him, he stepped away from theft and other offenses that had defined so much of his earlier life. The reasons for this change are unclear, but it is possible that his work as a clerk, which began in 1946, gave him some sort of stability and purpose that crime had never provided. In 1937, the Christies moved into the top-floor flat of 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill, a neighborhood that had fallen into considerable disrepair over the years as property values declined and investment dried up. The area had once been respectable, but by the 1930s it had become a place where the poor and working classes lived in crowded, neglected conditions. By December 1938, they had relocated downstairs to the ground-floor flat, where they would remain for the rest of their lives together, years that would become increasingly strange and isolated. The building itself was a 3-story brick-end terrace, a common type of Victorian housing constructed during the 1870s in an era of rapid and often careless speculative building. During that period of intensive construction, builders had thrown up housing quickly and cheaply, prioritizing quantity over quality, resulting in properties that were already showing signs of age and deterioration by the 1930s. Over the decades, these buildings had deteriorated into rundown multi-occupancy rentals that attracted working-class tenants with limited means and few alternatives. Number 10 Rillington Place was typical of its kind and period. The ground and first floors each contained a modest bedroom and living room with a small kitchen in an adjacent extension. The cramped top floor consisted of only a kitchen living room and a bedroom, offering minimal space and comfort. The living conditions throughout the building were decidedly squalid by modern standards. All the building's occupants shared a single outside lavatory located in the rear yard, a toilet that served perhaps a dozen people or more, creating obvious problems with cleanliness and privacy. Not a single flat in the building possessed a bathroom, meaning that residents had to wash in basins or tin baths that had to be filled by hand with water heated on the stove. Water itself had to be manually heated in pots and kettles, a time-consuming process that discouraged frequent bathing. Basic hygiene and cleanliness were extraordinarily difficult to maintain in such crowded, neglected circumstances, and disease could spread quickly through such close quarters. Around 1939, as the world drifted toward another devastating war, Christie found work as a foreman at the Commodore Cinema in King Street, Hammersmith, a position that gave him some responsibility and suggested that he might finally be settling into a more legitimate and respectable life. The cinema was a place of escape and entertainment for Londoners, and Christie's role as foreman meant he had authority over other workers and represented management. However, in the summer of that year, an opportunity presented itself that would ultimately prove far more significant and far more sinister than any cinema job could be. With war looming and the authorities desperate for additional personnel to maintain public order and carry out civil defense duties, Christie applied to become a war reserve constable. The recruitment process was hasty and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of new applicants who flooded the application system. The authorities, simply overwhelmed by the numbers and facing pressure to get people trained quickly, appear to have conducted only minimal background checks. Crucially, they failed to uncover or they deliberately overlooked Christie's substantial criminal record, a record that should have disqualified him immediately from any position of authority. He began his duties as a WRC on September 1, 1939, the very day that Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in response to the invasion of Poland. Christie was assigned to the Harrow Road Police Station, a position that placed him in close proximity to police officers and gave him a uniform and official authority. It was at the police station that Christie met a woman named Gladys Jones, a woman with whom he began a secret affair that would last for several years. The relationship persisted throughout much of the Second World War, lasting until mid-1943, when circumstances forced it to an abrupt and violent end. Gladys's husband, a soldier serving overseas in the war in defense of his country, returned home on leave, seeking a peaceful reunion with his wife. Upon discovering his wife's infidelity and finding Christie present in their home, the husband's rage was immediate and violent. He attacked Christie, beating him severely in retaliation for the betrayal and the humiliation of his wife's affair with another man. Between the years 1943 and 1953, a period of exactly 1 decade, Christie committed a series of murders that would ultimately shock post-war Britain and force a reckoning with failures in the criminal justice system. His method was remarkably consistent and deliberate. He would render his victims unconscious using domestic gas that contained carbon monoxide, rendering them helpless and unable to resist, and then strangle them with a length of rope. Some of his victims he assaulted while they lay unconscious and dying, robbing them of their dignity in their final moments. Christie's first admitted victim was a young woman named Ruth Fewest, a 21-year-old Austrian munitions worker who came to London during the war and supplemented her meager wages by occasionally engaging in prostitution. She was a vulnerable young woman far from her home, trying to survive in a hostile foreign country during wartime, offering easy prey for a predator like Christie. Christie claimed that he met Fewest while she was soliciting clients in a snack bar located in Ladbroke Grove, an area known for such activities. On August 24, 1943, Christie invited her back to his flat for sexual purposes, knowing that his wife Ethel was away visiting relatives and would not be present to interrupt. After they had sexual relations, in what must have been an impulsive act driven by long-suppressed rage and the certainty that he could act without consequence, Christie strangled her on his bed with a length of rope. The act was sudden and violent, a moment in which all the resentment and psychological disorder that Christie carried within himself erupted into action. He initially stowed Fewest's body beneath the floorboards of his living room, hiding the evidence of his crime in a space that could be easily concealed. But he did not leave her there. The following evening, he buried her body in the small back garden of 10 Rillington Place, covering her remains with earth and hoping that they would never be discovered. On December 28 that same year, As if he were shedding one identity for another, Christie resigned from his position as a reserve constable. Perhaps he realized that his role as a representative of law and order would eventually expose him to scrutiny, or perhaps he simply no longer needed the authority that the position gave him. The following year, Christie found work as a clerk at an Acton radio factory, a position that placed him among workers and gave him access to colleagues. It was there that he met his second victim, Muriel Amelia Eady, a woman who worked alongside him at the factory and whom he gradually began to manipulate. On October 7, 1944, Christie invited Eady back to his flat under the most cynical and calculated of false pretenses. He told her that he had concocted a special mixture that could cure her bronchitis, a respiratory ailment from which she was suffering. He promised her relief from her symptoms, medical assistance from a concerned colleague who had her best interests at heart. He prepared a tube connected to a jar and told her to breathe in the mixture to ease her cough. What she did not know was that the jar contained Friar's balsam, a strong-smelling substance that Christie used deliberately to mask the smell of domestic gas, which would otherwise have been detected immediately. The domestic gas of the 1940s was coal gas, a substance with a carbon monoxide content of 15%, sufficient to render a person unconscious relatively quickly if properly applied. Once Eady was positioned and breathing from the tube with her back turned, trusting in Christie's false concern for her health, Christie connected a second tube to the gas tap. As Eady continued to breathe deeply from the tube, drawing what she believed to be medicinal vapor, she was in reality inhaling the domestic gas that gradually rendered her unconscious. As her consciousness slipped away, Christie assaulted her sexually, and then strangled her with a length of rope before she could regain awareness and cry out. He then buried her alongside Ruth Fewest in the back garden, two women hidden beneath the soil in that small yard where neighbors sometimes hung their washing. In the spring of 1948, a young married couple named Timothy and Beryl Evans moved into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place, the same building where Christie lived on the ground floor. Timothy was a working-class man trying to make a living and support a family, and Beryl was his wife, a woman seeking to build a life with her husband in London. That October, Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, and for a brief time, the family appeared to be establishing some sort of normal domestic life together. But by late 1949, everything had changed and dissolved into tragedy and mystery. Timothy Evans went to the police and reported that his wife was dead, though he was vague about the circumstances and seemed confused and frightened. The initial police search of the building turned up nothing, no sign of Beryl's body anywhere within the flat or its immediate surroundings. But a more thorough search eventually discovered the bodies of Beryl, Geraldine, and a 16-week-old male fetus in an outdoor wash house located in the rear yard of the property. Beryl's body had been wrapped carefully in both a blanket and a tablecloth, as if someone had taken care to conceal the evidence of violence. The post-mortem examination revealed that both mother and daughter had been strangled, and that Beryl had suffered physical assault before her death, evidenced by significant facial bruising that suggested a violent struggle. Evans initially claimed that Christie had killed his wife, that Christie had attempted to perform an abortion on Beryl and had killed her in the process. But after police questioning, which likely involved considerable pressure and intimidation, Evans allegedly confessed to the murders himself. However, the confession was almost certainly fabricated by police. The statement they attributed to Evans contained odd, formal language and phrasing that seemed completely out of place for an uneducated working-class young man under extreme emotional distress. The words and phrases seemed to have been composed by educated officers rather than spoken by Evans, suggesting that police had essentially put words into his mouth. After being charged with the murders, Evans withdrew his confession and once again accused Christie, insisting that it was Christie who had killed both his wife and his daughter. On January 11, 1950, Timothy Evans was put on trial for the murder of his daughter. The prosecution had strategically decided not to pursue a separate charge for his wife's death. Perhaps they believed it would be easier to secure a conviction on a single charge, or perhaps they simply wanted to streamline the proceedings. Christie was the principal witness for the Crown at Evans' trial, and he denied Evans' accusations completely. He provided detailed evidence about alleged quarrels between Evans and his wife, testimony designed to paint Evans as a violent and abusive husband capable of strangling his own family. The jury found Evans guilty despite the revelation of Christie's own criminal record for theft and violence, crimes that should have given them reason to doubt his testimony. Evans was originally scheduled to be hanged on January 31st, but he appealed his conviction, desperately hoping that a higher court might see the injustice of his trial. After his appeal failed on February 20th, Evans was hanged at HM Prison Pentonville on March 9, 1950, dying for murders that he almost certainly did not commit. The police investigation into the Evans case was plagued by serious errors and oversights that were almost beyond comprehension. Most significantly, the officers investigating completely missed the remains of Christie's previous murder victims, Ruth Fewest and Muriel Eady, buried in the small garden at 10 Rillington Place. Later, one of Eady's bones, a femur, was even found being used to prop up a fence, a detail so grotesque it seemed almost impossible. Although several searches were conducted at the house after Evans confessed, the police never properly examined the wash house or excavated the garden with any thoroughness. It was clear that no systematic search of the crime scene had been conducted, and no forensic expertise had been applied to the investigation. Police accepted all of Christie's statements as true without scrutiny or serious questioning, treating him as reliable largely because he was a former War Reserve constable, one of their own. As historian Ludovic Kennedy noted in his subsequent research, this reliance on Christie's testimony was highly questionable and highly suspicious. Here was a man with criminal convictions for theft and violence, providing key testimony against a man who had no history of violence whatsoever. The logic of the investigation was backwards and wrong, but it had led to Evans' conviction nonetheless. Nearly 3 years passed without major incident for Christie following Evans' trial and execution. He found work as a clerk with the British Road Services at their Shepherd's Bush depot, starting on June 12, 1950, a position that gave him steady employment and income. At the same time, new tenants from the West Indies began to arrive at 10 Rillington Place, filling the vacant flats as the building's population shifted. This demographic change horrified Christie and his wife Ethel, who both held deeply racist attitudes towards their new neighbors. They resented living in close proximity to people they regarded as inferior or unwelcome, and this resentment festered and grew. Christie negotiated with the Poor Man's Lawyer Center to have exclusive use of the back garden, claiming ostensibly that he wanted space between himself and his neighbors, a place where he could retreat to escape the proximity he found so distasteful. But this explanation seems almost certainly false. More likely, Christie wanted exclusive access to the garden in order to prevent anyone from uncovering the human remains that he had buried there years earlier. On the morning of December 14, 1952, Christie strangled his wife Ethel in bed while she slept or lay unaware of what was about to happen. She had last been seen in public 2 days earlier, going about her ordinary business with no idea that death was approaching. After her death, Christie set about constructing a series of false stories to explain her disappearance and to forestall any inquiries that might be made into her whereabouts. In reply to a letter from relatives living in Sheffield, he wrote that Ethel had rheumatism and was unable to write to them herself, but that she was thinking of them. To one neighbor, he explained that she was visiting her relatives in Sheffield for an extended stay. To another neighbor, he told a different story entirely, claiming that she had gone to Birmingham on business. These contradictory stories should have raised suspicions, but they did not. Christie had resigned from his job at Shepherd's Bush on December 6th and had been unemployed since then. To support himself, he engaged in a series of petty transactions designed to convert his wife's possessions into cash. On December 17th, he sold his wife's wedding ring and watch for £2.10. On January 8, 1953, he sold furniture for which he received £11, carefully selecting items that Ethel would not have missed immediately had she been alive. He kept cutlery, 2 chairs, a mattress, and his kitchen table, essentials that he needed for his daily life. From January 23rd to March 20th, he received his weekly unemployment benefit of £3.12, money that helped him survive during his period without formal employment. On January 26, 1953, in a stunning display of calculated betrayal, Christie forged his wife's signature and emptied her bank account, stealing the money that she had accumulated during her working life. On February 27, 1953, he sold some of her clothing for £3 5 shillings. He also received a check for £8 on March 7th from the Bradford Clothing and Supply Company, money that came from additional sales of her possessions. Between January 19th and March 6, 1953, Christie murdered 3 more women whom he invited back to 10 Rillington Place: Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina MacLennan. Each woman was vulnerable in her own way. Each woman was seeking something that Christie promised to provide, and each woman would fall victim to his carefully constructed deceptions. Kathleen Maloney was a sex worker from the Ladbroke Grove area, a woman accustomed to going to strangers' flats and taking considerable risks with her safety. Rita Nelson was from Belfast and was visiting her sister in Ladbroke Grove. She was 6 months pregnant when she encountered Christie, carrying a child within her and facing the prospect of single motherhood. Christie first met Hectorina MacLennan, who was living in London with her boyfriend, Alex Baker, in a cafe where she frequented. All 3 of these women met with Christie on several occasions, as he carefully cultivated relationships with them and gained their trust. He let MacLennan and Baker stay at Rillington Place while they searched for accommodation, playing the role of helpful landlord and friend. On another occasion, Christie lured MacLennan back to his flat alone and murdered her. He then deliberately convinced Baker, who came to Rillington Place looking desperately for MacLennan, that he had not seen her in recent days. Christie kept up this pretense for several days, meeting Baker regularly to see if he had any news of MacLennan's whereabouts and offering to help him search for her, all the while knowing exactly where she was. For these final 3 victims, Christie modified the gassing technique he had first used on Edie, creating a more efficient and controlled method of murder. He used a rubber tube connected to the gas pipe in his kitchen, which he kept closed off with a bulldog clip. When he was ready to murder, he would seat his victims in the kitchen, telling them stories or offering them tea, keeping them calm and unsuspecting. Then he would release the clip on the tube and let gas leak slowly into the room. The gas made his victims drowsy, disoriented, and confused as the carbon monoxide entered their lungs and their consciousness began to slip away. Once they were sufficiently weakened, Christie strangled them with a length of rope, ending their lives as they lay semi-conscious and unable to resist effectively. As with Edie, Christie repeatedly assaulted his last 3 victims while they were unconscious and continued to do so as they died, robbing them even of dignity in death. After Christie had murdered each victim by ligature strangulation, he carefully placed a vest or other cloth-like material between their legs. He then wrapped their semi-naked bodies in blankets in a similar manner to the way in which Beryl Evans' body had been wrapped years earlier. He then stowed their bodies in a small alcove located behind the back kitchen wall, a space that was not immediately visible to casual observation. Later, he covered the entrance to this alcove with wallpaper, creating the appearance of a solid wall and concealing the evidence of his crimes from anyone who might have occasion to enter his kitchen. On March 20th, 1953, Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place after fraudulently subletting his flat to a young couple from whom he extracted £7 13 shillings in advance rent. The landlord, who made regular visits to collect rent and inspect his properties, visited that same evening and discovered the couple living in the flat instead of Christie. Angered by this fraudulent subletting arrangement, the landlord demanded that the couple leave first thing in the morning and return to wherever they had come from. The landlord allowed the tenant of the top-floor flat, a man named Beresford Brown, to use Christie's kitchen as a temporary arrangement while the situation was sorted out. On March 24th, Brown was attempting to insert brackets into the wall to hold a wireless set when he made a discovery that would set in motion the investigation that would ultimately expose Christie's crimes. Peeling back the wallpaper that covered the wall, Brown saw something that made his blood run cold. The bodies of Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina MacLennan, wrapped in blankets and concealed in the alcove behind the wall. Shocked and horrified, Brown got confirmation from another tenant in Rillington Place that there were indeed dead bodies concealed within the building. He immediately informed the police, and a citywide search for Christie began with urgency and intensity. After leaving Rillington Place, Christie had made his way to a Roten house, a type of cheap lodging house common in London, located in King's Cross, and he had booked a room for 7 nights under his own name and with his actual address. It was a strangely careless decision for someone who must have known that his crimes would eventually be discovered. He stayed for only 4 nights, leaving abruptly on March 24th when news broke of the discovery at his flat, news that quickly spread through the city and the newspapers. In the days that followed, Christie wandered around London aimlessly, a hunted man with nowhere to go and no plan for escape. He slept rough in the streets and parks, spending much of the day sitting in cafes and cinemas, seeking warmth and the anonymity of crowds. On March 28th, in an attempt to raise money, he pawned his watch in Battersea for 10 shillings, a transaction that would provide a record of his location and movements. On the morning of March 31st, Christie was arrested on the embankment near Putney Bridge after being challenged about his identity by a police officer, P.C. Thomas Ledger. The officer had noticed something suspicious about this unkempt man wandering near the river and had approached him to determine his identity and purpose. When police searched Christie, they discovered an old newspaper clipping about the remand of Timothy Evans among the personal items he was carrying, a detail that would take on enormous significance in the days and weeks to come. During initial police questioning, Christie initially admitted only to the murders of the women in the kitchen alcove and of his wife Ethel. When informed about the skeletons that had been discovered buried in the back garden of 10 Rillington Place, he admitted responsibility for those deaths as well. On April 27, 1953, Christie confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans, the very murder for which Timothy Evans had been tried, convicted, and executed 4 years earlier. This confession sent shockwaves through London and the British legal system, raising the terrible possibility that an innocent man had been hanged for a crime Christie himself had committed. For the most part, however, Christie denied killing Geraldine, the small child whose body had been found alongside her mother. On one occasion following his trial, in conversation with a hospital orderly, Christie indicated that he may have been responsible for Geraldine's death as well, having said so almost in passing to this minor official. It is widely speculated that Christie would not have been eager to readily admit his guilt in Geraldine's death for tactical reasons. If he admitted to murdering the child, it would be much harder for a jury to find him not guilty by reason of insanity, a defense that required a certain consistency and a certain limitation to his crimes. Additionally, admitting to such a brutal crime against a small child would have endangered his safety from fellow inmates had he survived his trial. On June 5, 1953, Christie confessed to the murders of Muriel Adey and Ruth Fewest, his first 2 victims. These confessions helped the police to identify the decomposed skeletons that had been unearthed in the garden, providing evidence that connected the remains to specific victims. Christie was tried only for the murder of his wife Ethel, a strategic decision by the prosecutors to focus on a single, easily provable crime. His trial began on June 22, 1953, in the same court in which Timothy Evans had been tried 3 years earlier, an eerie symmetry that added to the sense of injustice. Christie pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, with his defense team describing him as mad as a March hare, a figure so psychologically damaged that he could not be held responsible for his actions. He claimed to have a poor memory of many events, particularly the circumstances of his crimes, presenting himself as confused and fundamentally broken. A doctor named Matheson, who worked at HM Prison Brixton and had been assigned to evaluate Christie's mental state, was called as a witness by the prosecution. He testified, using the medical terminology of the time, that Christie suffered from a hysterical personality, but was fundamentally not insane in the legal sense. The jury, after hearing all the evidence and considering the defense arguments, rejected Christie's plea of insanity. After deliberating for 85 minutes, they returned a verdict of guilty. Mr. Justice Finnemore pronounced the sentence of death. On June 29th, Christie stated to his legal representatives that he would not be making an appeal against his conviction. Perhaps he had accepted the inevitability of his fate, or perhaps he wished to spare the families of his victims the further ordeal of an appeal trial. On July 2nd, Evan's mother, seeking any sort of truth or closure or perhaps justice of a delayed nature, wrote to Christie asking him to confess all. She wanted him to provide a complete and truthful account of what had happened to her son, though no amount of truth could bring Timothy back from the dead. On July 8th, George Rogers, the member of Parliament who represented Christie's constituency, interviewed Christie for 45 minutes in his cell about the murders. Rogers was seeking information and perhaps trying to understand how such a man could have lived in plain sight, committing such terrible crimes. The following day, Christie spoke to the Scott Henderson inquiry about the murders, providing testimony that was intended to help clarify the facts surrounding the deaths and his role in them. 4 days later, the Home Secretary, David Maxwell Fyfe, announced that he could not find any grounds, medically or psychologically, for Christie to be reprieved. There would be no last-minute intervention to spare his life, no unexpected mercy from the authorities. Among Christie's final visitors while he sat in the condemned cell awaiting execution was an ex-Army friend named Dennis Haig, who visited on July 13th. The prison governor also visited, as did Christie's sister, Phyllis Clark, who came on the night before his execution. George Rogers, his member of Parliament, wanted to speak to Christie a second time on that final night, but Christie refused to meet him again. According to both Haig and Clark, Christie appeared almost resigned towards his death, as if he had made some sort of peace with his fate or had simply exhausted whatever emotional resources he had left. On the morning of July 15, 1953, Christie was hanged at 9:00 a.m. at HM Prison Pentonville. His executioner was Albert Pierrepoint, the same man who had hanged Timothy Evans 3 years earlier, a dark and terrible coincidence. After being pinioned for execution, his body secured and prepared, Christie complained that his nose itched, a small human detail that cut through the formality of the proceeding. Pierrepoint assured him in a voice that must have seemed almost kind, "It won't bother you for long." After the execution, Christie's body was buried in an unmarked grave within the precincts of the prison, as was standard practice for executed prisoners in the United Kingdom. No headstone marked his grave, and no family was permitted to claim his remains for burial elsewhere. Based on the pubic hair that Christie had collected and kept, items that were discovered during police investigation and examination of his possessions, it has been speculated by experts and observers that he was responsible for a greater number of murders than those carried out at 10 Rillington Place. He claimed that the 4 different clumps of hair in his collection came from his wife Ethel and the 3 bodies discovered in the kitchen alcove. However, forensic examination revealed that only Ethel matched the hair type that was found on those bodies and on his possessions. Even if 2 of the other clumps had come from the bodies of Ruth Fewest and Muriel Eady, which had by then decomposed into partial skeletons, there was still 1 remaining clump of hair that could not be accounted for or identified. It could not have come from Beryl Evans, as no pubic hair had been removed from her body during the time of her murder, suggesting a different victim altogether. In 1978, more than 25 years after Christie's execution, Professor Keith Simpson, one of the leading pathologists involved in the forensic examination of Christie's victims, offered his professional assessment of the hair collection. Simpson noted that it seemed odd and suspicious that Christie would have claimed that hair came from the bodies discovered in the alcove, if the hair had actually come from those now reduced to skeletons and bone. He also found it unlikely that in his last 4 murders, the only trophy that Christie had taken was from the one woman with whom he had not engaged in sexual assault while she was dying. Simpson concluded that it was even more odd and troubling that one of his trophies had definitely not come from any of the unfortunate women known to have been involved in his crimes. No serious attempts were ever made or have since been made to trace any further possible victims of Christie, such as examining comprehensive records of missing women in London during the period of his activity. Police did not conduct this sort of investigation, and no systematic effort has been undertaken in subsequent decades to determine whether Christie may have killed additional people. Michael Eddowes, a criminologist and investigator, suggested that Christie had been in a perfect position, working as a War Reserve constable with access to official records and channels, to have committed many more murders than those that have been discovered and documented. Eddowes speculated that Christie might have killed numerous other women whose disappearances had been accepted without question or investigation. However, the historian Jonathan Oates considers it unlikely that Christie had any further victims beyond those already documented. Oates argues that Christie would not have deviated from his standard method of killing and disposing of bodies in his place of residence, his flat at 10 Rillington Place. The alcove in his kitchen and the garden of the property were his killing ground, and Oates suggests that victims found in other locations would not fit Christie's established pattern. Following Christie's conviction and the revelation of his crimes, there was substantial and immediate controversy concerning the earlier trial of Timothy Evans, a man now dead who had been convicted largely on the evidence of Christie himself. Evans had been tried and convicted for murders committed in the same property in which Christie lived, murders that Christie claimed he had committed himself. Christie confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans, the wife of Timothy, and although he neither confessed to nor was formally charged with the murder of Geraldine, his daughter, he was widely considered guilty of both murders by the public and press. This confession cast serious doubt on the fairness of Evans' trial 3 years earlier, and raised the terrible possibility that an innocent person had been hanged for crimes he did not commit. The controversy was immediate and powerful, and it reached the highest levels of government. The Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe, feeling the weight of public pressure and concern, commissioned an official inquiry led by John Scott Henderson QC, the Recorder of Portsmouth, to investigate whether Evans had been innocent and whether a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred. Henderson's task was difficult and complex: to reconstruct events from years past, to interview witnesses with faulty memories, and to determine the truth about who had killed whom in the flat at 10 Rillington Place. Henderson interviewed Christie before his execution, seeking his account of events and his explanation for his confessions. He also interviewed another 20 witnesses who had been involved in one way or another in either of the police investigations into the murders. After conducting his inquiry, Henderson concluded that Timothy Evans was in fact guilty of both murders and that Christie's confessions to the murder of Beryl were unreliable and had been made in the context of furthering his own defense that he was legally insane. However, Henderson's conclusions were almost immediately met with skepticism and criticism. Questions continued to be raised in Parliament concerning Evans' innocence, with members of Parliament demanding a more thorough investigation. Parallel with the parliamentary questions, newspaper campaigns were launched claiming Evans' innocence, and books began to be published making detailed arguments for Evans' exoneration. The Henderson inquiry itself was heavily criticized for being held over too short a time period, only 1 week, insufficient to conduct a thorough and careful investigation. Critics also argued that the inquiry had been prejudiced against the possibility that Evans was innocent, that it had been designed to reach predetermined conclusions rather than to discover the truth. This controversy, combined with the coincidence that two stranglers would have been living in the same property at the same time if both Evans and Christie had been guilty, kept alive concerns that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred in Evans' trial. The very idea seemed almost impossible, that two separate murderers would have been committing murders in the same flat, killing different victims, would have stretched credulity almost to the breaking point. This uncertainty about Evans' guilt, which lingered for many years, eventually led to a second, more thorough inquiry. This inquiry was chaired by High Court Judge Sir Daniel Brabham, a jurist with significant experience in complex legal matters. The Brabham inquiry was conducted over the winter of 1965 and 1966, a more extended investigation that took considerably more time than Henderson's brief 1-week inquiry. Brabham re-examined much of the evidence from both trials and took seriously the arguments that had been made for Evans' innocence in the years since his execution. His conclusions were nuanced and subtle. He determined that it was more probable than not that Timothy Evans had killed his wife Beryl, but had not killed his daughter Geraldine. For Geraldine's death, Brabham concluded that Christie was almost certainly responsible. Brabham suggested that Christie's likely motive for killing Geraldine was that the child's presence would have drawn immediate attention to Beryl's disappearance, a tension that would have resulted in an investigation into what had happened to the child's mother. Christie would have wanted to avoid such investigation, as it would have increased the risk that his own murders and the bodies buried in his garden would be discovered. Brabin also noted in his findings that the uncertainty involved in the case would have prevented a jury, acting in accordance with proper legal standards, from being satisfied beyond reasonable doubt of Evans' guilt had he been retried with all the available evidence. This was a damning conclusion. It suggested that Evans should never have been convicted in the first place, that the evidence against him had been insufficient. These conclusions from the Brabin report were used by Home Secretary Roy Jenkins to recommend a posthumous pardon for Timothy Evans, an attempt to clear his name and acknowledge the miscarriage of justice. The pardon was granted, though it could not undo the fact that Evans had already been hanged for crimes he almost certainly did not commit. Jenkins announced the granting of Evans' pardon to the House of Commons on October 18, 1966, a formal acknowledgement of wrong that had been done. Evans' remains were subsequently exhumed from where they had been buried and returned to his family, who arranged for him to be reburied in a private grave where his memory could be properly honored. Evans' execution and other controversial cases that emerged in the 1960s contributed significantly to the 1965 suspension of capital punishment in the United Kingdom. The injustice of his case became emblematic of the dangers of capital punishment, and it contributed to the eventual abolition of the death penalty in Britain. In January 2003, more than 50 years after Evans' execution, the Home Office awarded Evans' half-sister Mary Westlake and his sister Eileen Ashby ex gratia payments as compensation for the miscarriage of justice in his trial. An amount of money could not undo the decades of loss and grief, but it was an official acknowledgement that wrong had been done to their family. The independent assessor for the Home Office, Lord Brennan QC, was asked to evaluate the evidence and make findings. Lord Brennan accepted without reservation that the conviction and execution of Timothy Evans for the murder of his child was wrongful and a miscarriage of justice. He further stated that there is no evidence to implicate Timothy Evans in the murder of his wife. She was most probably murdered by Christie. Lord Brennan believed that the Brabin report's conclusion that Evans probably murdered his wife should be rejected given the strength of Christie's confessions and his conviction for the murder of Beryl. The matter was thus officially and finally resolved. Timothy Evans was innocent of the charges for which he had been executed, a victim of misidentified justice and police incompetence.